Brandon, what's going on? Good to see you.
Hey, Sam. Good to see you as always.
Yeah, so for some background with listeners here, Brandon and I worked together at a company called LivePerson a handful of years back, and I led the inside sales team there. So think appointment setters who are cold calling, emailing, LinkedIn for appointments, and Brandon was the top performer on our strategic seller team. So selling into the biggest logos, and I think one of the most creative salespeople I've met in terms of thoughtfulness as it relates to approaching C-level executives at companies that everyone would know the names of.
Yeah, man, that was quite the ride. It was really, one of the best teams that I was a part of for sure. And, in that 4-year period that I was there, uh, you know, knocked down some massive logos from Delta Airlines to Chipotle to United Healthcare. And, we were part of a really special team. So, yeah, felt like I was able to ride that wave, really well. But couldn't have done it without the great support from your group, and we had an awesome manager in Sean Burke, and just awesome people on the team. So yeah, it was like the perfect storm at the perfect time.
Yeah, and I got the pleasure of working for Sean 3 times in 3 different companies. So a lot of credit that I give in terms of like having someone who will give you a step up type role. I credit to him for myself and having someone who will go bet on you to give you a role that's maybe above where you're at today, but something you can go grow into. So I'm always super grateful from the guidance and the opportunities from him as well. But let's talk about you. I think
Yeah.
you're someone as well who I've seen earn really, really well. Like if you look at the two routes you really go in sales, right? One route is you go the route of leadership, right? You go from selling to being a manager to being a manager of managers to being a leader of division to being potentially a CRO in the future, or you go the route that you took, right? Where you keep selling bigger and bigger and more strategic type deals. So, one, curious why you went down that route of looking to go sell bigger and more complex deals rather than the more traditional route of leading bigger and bigger and higher performing teams.
Yeah. So just to rewind a little bit, I happened into sales as most people, typically do. This was not a deliberate career choice. So I originally tried to become a professional soccer player, in my early 20s. Had high ambitions, probably more ambitions than my actual talent. So tried to break through with a club in Eastern Europe. Fortunately, that didn't happen for me. Ran into some injury issues. And so when I was sort of starting my journey, I joined a soccer education startup out of Long Island. And I sort of start to cut my entrepreneurial teeth there. We were only 4 of us when we joined. We eventually grew it to 50 plus employees in less than 4 years. And what I learned was I was selling without even selling. I was in charge of our what we called our player development division. So I had to train, but also sell packages for small groups or one-on-one individual training. And I think I learned a really valuable lesson. Like the best way to sell is to never sell. And so I sort of took that with me, kind of mixed with this idea of how do you build something from like an idea into something bigger. And I took that with me, and I was with that company for about 4 years. And being in my 20s, wanted to live and experience New York City. So instead of doing the reverse commute, I was living in Queens at the time, going out to Long Island. I wanted to work and live in Manhattan. And as you know, and you grew up in New York, it's a very expensive place. I didn't have a strong financial footing at that time. So I had to supplement my income by DJing. It was another interest that I had developed at that time. Started off as a hobby, but then kind of turned that into at least a steady income that could at least pay my rent. And then during the day, I got an account manager role, ironically, with a DJ company. And they were doing some really interesting things. They were using DJs to uh, program background music for some pretty iconic brands like Crunch Fitness Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, and Gucci. And that was like my first account, which was awesome. But had to learn like how to be a pro seller. And that's where I really cut my teeth when it came to, cold calling, outreach, all the various ways that you need to get the attention of others to say, hey, we have a service, we have a product, we have an offering that can be of value to you. And what I always, fast forward, many years, sort of going through that motion, met my now wife, girlfriend at the time. She was finishing up nursing school. We had lived in New York City for quite a long time, and we were just thinking to ourselves, okay, is this where we want to be forever? And we decided, hey, we're going to take things to the next level. So we moved to Florida, Sarasota, where she grew up. And it was always meant to be just sort of a stepping stone to maybe, going to, we were thinking about like the Bay Area in California at the time. But anyways, we got here and I had to start all over. I didn't have a network here. So I started by selling $45 print ads in a local paper to small businesses. And that's where I really had to cut my teeth in, like, knocking on doors, cold outreach, and eventually started to climb the ranks from there. Got into more digital sales, online businesses, helping still small businesses, but at least moved over to SaaS. And then from there, kind of went into mid-market and then eventually enterprise to eventually, the last stop in my corporate career, which was with you at LivePerson, going after those massive logos. But during that time frame, I tell you all this because during all that time in all those various roles, I was approached by our leaders to become a manager multiple times, manage teams, and it just never felt right to me because I think my core principle was autonomy. I looked around me and I saw the rotating chair of managers coming in and out, and I saw the tenure there. So one, I didn't want either that pressure, but two, just I knew from an earnings standpoint and from a stability standpoint and from just an autonomy and being left alone standpoint that the best way was always to maintain being an individual contributor. And so I looked at the best way of taking power into my own hands was staying as an individual contributor, but moving myself up into the right environment. And I kind of always told myself, hey, I will be my own business operator within this larger business. And if either the earnings stop or the learning stops, then I'll move on to the next level. And that's sort of how things played out. And roughly 17 years of actively selling, I was able to earn enough to then, follow my true ambitions, which was to do my own thing completely on my terms. And that's what I was fortunate to be able to do after building, 7-figure annual earnings at LivePerson. I was able to now become essentially my own VC, where I could invest in the things that I want to do and fully own my calendar. And I've been in that in about 3 years.
Yeah, there's a lot of good points there. I think first you make a really big point, right? If you're an IC, right, if you're selling yourself in tech, software, whatever it may be, right, you can really go operate as the CEO of your own business, right, where you get a level of autonomy, assuming your performance is there, right? If you're not performing, it's not very fun.
Yeah.
If you're performing well, right, most leadership, unless you're causing problems internally or doing something like that, you usually get a lot of leeway with what you're doing and resources there to go support you rather than having to go comply to the normal standards of management at times.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a leader, right, which I went that route myself, a few things happen, right? One, you actually get away from doing the work yourself, and more so you go more internal facing versus external, right? You're in meetings with finance, operations, product, right? Marketing, all these different departments that you have to go work with. versus just owning your number. You
Hmm.
also get away from doing the work yourself too, which some people it's way less fun,
Yeah.
right? In terms of actually doing deals. So I think it's important to understand what your deal outcome is and what you do to go align to that. I think next on your end, like building that own book of business yourself and then going to walk away from it, right? Like, how did you decide that that was the right time to go walk away from, you know, earning seven figures in your last few years there? How did you decide that was the right time for you to go bridge the gap and go leave?
Yeah. So I'll answer the second one first. So, feeling comfortable with that was actually after multiple conversations with multiple people. One, I had different coaches that I was working with at the time that I was personally invested in. So, we had sort of Sean as just a great leader internally, but he was sort of more of a coach that really supported us and helped us to follow kind of our own personal ambitions and how we can use our roles inside LivePerson to do that. So we were fortunate to have someone like Sean, but I went outside as well. So I worked with Andy Paul, who's sort of a well-known sales coach and prominent author in the sales space. And Sean connected me with Andy, and we worked on more of the sales tactics and strategies at that high strategic level. But I also had a mindset performance coach because when I landed in that role, even though I had been successful on paper, internally, I suffered a lot from imposter syndrome. And so working with that mindset coach was really valuable because she helped kind of reframe some of these limiting beliefs that I was unnecessarily putting on myself. But one of the things we discussed was I had ambitions of doing my own thing really throughout my whole journey because I got a taste of that when I joined that startup out of school, back when I was 22, 23. And I always knew once I kind of got a taste of entrepreneurship, I wanted to run my own company. I just didn't know what that looked like. And maybe you experienced this as well. In sales, it's like training wheels for entrepreneurship. And we can, if you do it right, you can uh, you express yourself as you're essentially an entrepreneur, meaning you've got all the infrastructure there without all the risks of being a true entrepreneur. But I knew I wanted to take that leap at some point. And so when I was working with my mindset coach Amber, we defined a plan of like, okay, in 10 years I want to be running my own coaching uh, program or being an independent consultant. And so that conversation mixed with a conversation with, my CPA and financial advisors of where we were looking at the tax burden on seven-figure W-2 earnings multiple years in a row, as well as conversations with, my wife and, my own ambitions to do my own thing. It just came to a head where it was, hey, if you're this good for somebody else, and you're paying the equivalent of a CEO's salary in taxes, what if you could do this on your own and be more thoughtful about investing sort of that income that you've put on the sidelines and invested that in your own personal brand, invested that in building assets that you can 100% own and build something that can build a legacy, so to speak. So all those things sort of came to a head as these earnings were sort of going through the roof. Um, but importantly, my wife and I, we didn't inflate our lifestyle. It was tempting to do that, to get a bigger home, you know, splurge on the Porsche 911, but we didn't do those things, even though we could have, because what again was guiding us in our life was the principle of true autonomy and resisting the temptations of inflating our lifestyle and then being able to step into something where we didn't have the pressure, the financial burden of back up against the wall. Either you go make this startup or whatever you do successful, or you don't eat, or you lose your home. We didn't want to put ourselves in that position. So I wanted to operate in a way where I felt like, all right, I don't need outside funding to grow my venture. I will be my own VC. So I will take these high earnings and the skills that I learned in sales, particularly strategic sales, and then use that as the on ramp to what I wanted to do. So all that sort of came to a head at the right time for us to feel comfortable. Okay, now it's the time to move. And now I'm 3 years into this. I'm still learning, right? Running a pretty steady 6-figure a year business. We don't have to scale it to 7 figures or 8 figures anytime soon. We'll grow into it, but we found our enough from a financial standpoint. We've got diversification, so we feel stable and we can make moves if anything changes in the markets outside of our control. But for first and foremost, I kind of feel like I can go into entrepreneurship almost treating it like art. That I can run experiments, learn from it without the pressure of somebody saying or answering to somebody because they gave us money. You've got to adhere to these KPIs and metrics. I can sort of learn that on my own, and then take the time to reinvest in learning new skills or trying different things that may or may not work, and then adapt and evolve over time. Because again, I want that autonomy for myself, and I was able to give that to myself. So that's where it all came about. But I couldn't have stepped into that without sort of mastering sales. Even though I wouldn't call myself a master of sales, it's still an ongoing evolution. But it gave me enough of the foundation that I am literally what helped me as a strategic seller. I'm still using some of those systems and frameworks today as an entrepreneur or solopreneur.
You look calm. You look relaxed, right? I think at times people optimize for one key part of their life. And if you're looking at people who are in the sales world, usually it's income, right?
Yeah.
Myself, when I was in sales too, like that was it. All I was focused on was income. And I was okay with doing things I wasn't thrilled with doing for the intention that, like you, I wanted to go build my own thing at some point as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no clue what that was. My take was, hey, in the interim, let me go make as much money as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm okay making sacrifices in other areas
Mm-hmm.
to earn those dollars. When I do go figure out what I want to go do, I can go all in much more quickly and go have that freedom. I think for you, you were in a similar spot where you're optimizing for areas right now outside of purely earnings, right? Like you look relaxed and you look calm, which most people can't say. So in your end, like what are you looking to optimize for in your life now outside of purely earnings, right? Because if you're making a few $100,000 a year as a coach or consultant, your open market value is more, right? If you're purely maximizing earnings. So what other areas of life are you looking at right now to go balance, maximize in that sense too?
Yeah, you can't see it off screen, but I have this big whiteboard and I have Jerry Eitzler's big ass calendar. It's the annual calendar that you can see in one shot. And so what I'm optimizing around now is this idea of like joyful human moments first, and then like the professional stuff filling in the blanks. And so this is the first year that I've been able to like design my year around trips that my wife and I want to take. We have an RV now, something I never thought I would ever do, but we have an RV, so we can take off and go on like 4 6-week trips, and explore any parks or any areas of the country that we want. And so what we're trying to do now is plan all that out in advance, and then I will block off my Calendly and my calendar, and I kind of look at going into every year at this point. Again, I'm still only 3 years into it, so I still have a lot to learn and a lot of areas to grow into. But the idea is I've got to block out what I want as a human first, and time with my wife, time working out, time like taking care of myself. I want all those things covered first, and then I'll layer in the professional stuff. Because as you said before, I had maybe not the best emotional relationship with money. Money was definitely a status symbol, because we learn that through society, but I also learned it through, to no fault of their own, my parents.
Sure.
I learned that like money is sort of a status symbol, and it shows like that you're worthy, right? If you have these certain status symbols that money can buy. And so I had to sort of unlearn those things the hard way. I went through a bankruptcy by overspending in my early adulthood. But what I learned from that experience coming out of that is money is definitely just a tool, right? We hear that all the time, but a lot of people still subscribe to the status symbols. Oh, I need a better car than the neighbor, or I need the biggest home on the block, or, those parents are sending their kid to that private school, so I've got to do that as well. And that can be a trap that keeps us not feeling calm, not feeling connected to a deeper purpose. And so for me, it's about exploring a deeper purpose and saying, okay, I've found my enough. I don't necessarily need more. I want to be sure that the buckets in my personal life are full, and then I can layer on the professional stuff. And going into each year, it's like I'm rehiring myself. And I can now be selective with, say, one consulting client, one corporate consulting client that I work with, that I can go deep with and feel relaxed, and not have to do it just to pay for, all these things that I've accumulated over time. I feel very secure that, hey, I'm only working with you because I want to make an impact. And same thing with the other areas that are more like direct with working with other sellers, like coaching. I can be selective in who I work with and how I work with them and when I work with them. And so that's really what I'm optimizing for at this stage of my life, is how do I always constantly put the human first and then the professional second, knowing actually when I'm a well-optimized human, the professional stuff takes care of itself because I'm removed from the income levels. And ironically, I think my best earning years are to come, but I'm not pushing for it, or I'm not obsessed about that. I'm just obsessed about how do I be a better husband? How do I be a healthier, stronger, more fit person? How do I build memories that when I look back on the previous year, I can look at my photos and say, wow, that was an experience that I never would have been able to do if I wasn't in the position that I am in now. And then be grateful for those things as well.
Yeah, so you got the matching whoop there as well too. That it's funny, like prioritizing taking care of yourself. The big ass calendar too. I'm very familiar with it. I heard him speak at a conference that I was at a few years back, and he's awesome. And it's a really cool way of thinking, right? Because you go solve for those big personal things first. Like if most people, they look at their calendar and it's okay, I've got a call here, a meeting there, a call here, and it's never really solving for what those blocks are for you personally.
Yeah.
Right. On my end, I do the same thing with you with travel, right? Where I'm like, hey, every quarter I want to go on a meaningful trip. Every month I want to go at least somewhere. And you start blocking those out. Same thing with the health and wellness side. Like on my calendar, I go to the gym in certain times every day, right? I go to the chiropractor certain times every day. Like those are blocked off on my calendar that you just can't move. Yeah. It's having those few things that for yourself that are allowing you to go be more of a holistic person. But something I want to dive in with you too is, what was that relationship like with yourself when you leave a job like you had? I think at times people really associate a lot of their value to the numbers, the status, the performance. And when you go build your own thing, and I've done it myself too, is that you go from being the top of the top to I am eating dirt for a while to go figure out what I'm doing. Not even necessarily financially, more so just in terms of your level of expertise and execution in this new thing. So feel free to go plug your new thing that you're working through as well. But also, like, what was that process like internally for you in terms of working through it?
Yeah. To be honest with you, I'm still working through that, mentally. Because like you said, when you put so many years and effort into sort of building an identity around high performance, and there's structure, there's recognition, there's, quarterly number to hit, there's an annual number to hit, there's President's Club, there's all these sort of feedback loops that it can be really isolating, especially in the endeavor of solopreneurship, right? And I bought into the allure of solopreneurship. Own your calendar, the freedom, the build lifestyle design, all those things are appealing. But what a lot of solopreneurs don't talk about, right? Because it doesn't sell the courses or ebooks or whatever the case may be, is it can be very isolating. And especially, you know, personally, I consider myself a neurodivergent individual. I know it's sort of like a hot topic to gravitate towards, but I suffered from depression, still do, and social anxiety. Mild case of ADHD. So being really thoughtful of my time, that was something that was like a weakness that I still have to work on to create as like a superpower, because I suffer from time blindness, even mild cases of like autism. So all these things, right, aren't necessarily debilitating for me personally, but they're struggles when you've got like this open canvas as a solopreneur, and now you go from like structure to figuring it out yourself, and your attention can easily be diverted to what should I be doing? What is like the high value stuff? So luckily, I can look back and take some of the things, because I ran pretty autonomously when I was working for others, that I can take some of those learnings into what I do now. But honestly, I still struggle with, um, the the motivation to do things, and to do things that I know I should be doing, and so that takes definitely like a level of, it's not just pure discipline, but a combination of you know the discipline mixed with curiosity, mixed with the flexibility of needing to adapt and learn, but also giving myself grace that, okay, I don't have all the answers. I can't be expected to know all the answers. Before, when there was a hierarchy and a structure and a number to go after, it was easy to just you know perform better, right, within those constraints, to
Sure.
now the constraints are like blown off and you have to create those constraints for yourself. That's something that frankly I still struggle with, mixed with some of these like you know neurodiversity like elements that I'm learning about myself as an individual, and just trying to figure it all out and continue to grow a profitable business, um, and maintain a healthy relationship, maintain healthy habits, and all those things. So I'm still, on that journey to figure it out, and I think that's part of it too. Is letting go, and realizing that that's a part of the fun. In essence, is that you don't have to have it all figured out. It doesn't have to be all laid out for you. That you can take the skills of learning in a structured environment, and especially when there isn't the financial burden, of needing to figure it out soon, uh, to allow yourself the grace to learn and experiment and fail, and then try again. And so I'm still going through that as we speak.
So when you look at being a solopreneur, like that's what it sounds like. You're
Yeah.
working for yourself,
Yeah.
likely by yourself, and going from being in a bigger corporate setting where you have support
Yeah.
resource at your disposal, it's a really different type game. Like for myself, even I run a mastermind community as well, and the last year, like it kind of went from side project to okay, there's a business here. And what I found with the audience I had and the community way I was structured today, that it was too small of an overall audience and too small of a business where I had to go take on roles that I didn't enjoy doing,
Yeah.
I wasn't good at doing.
Yeah.
And now I've kind of pivoted it to go be something that can have more scale.
Yeah.
So I can go bring in those right people to go help support on areas that they're better than in myself.
Yep.
And it's been a learning curve too in that middle ground, right? Where you have to go bridge the gap by yourself to
Yeah.
get it to a place to go hire those certain people, be able to go pay them what they need to be paid, to be able to get the business to a place of stability. So
Yeah.
on your end, like how do you handle working through those things yourself, being a solopreneur
Yeah.
where you likely have to do things that may not fall into your area of excellence and kind of
Yeah.
bridging that gap between whether it be part-time vendors, right,
Yeah.
or doing things yourself that maybe you know you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. So, uh, super insightful question. It kind of comes back to the calendar. That seems to be for me the reflection, and this is not my quote, and I forget who said this, but your calendar is a reflection of your values, and so I'm trying to live a life. I call it being the purposeful performer. That's like the name of the learning platform that I've built to help strategic sellers kind of follow the path and learn from my mistakes and successes, to use their sales career as a lever to move into entrepreneurship or solopreneurship. And what I've learned is that, okay, what we truly desire is owning our calendar. We want to fill it up with projects and things that bring us joy without having financial pressure. So how do you move to that? And so if you can use the calendar as a more structured way, again, especially for somebody like myself, where my attention can easily be diverted, and I need to use that as a focusing tool, and then use my calendar to reflect back on of, okay, I said I wanted to do these things. Did I do them? And that's how I sort of look at sort of either a year, a quarter, a month, a week, even a day, to say, all right, this is the tool that keeps me focused on the things that I want to build. And by starting with filling up the calendar first with the stuff that I know I need as a person, to keep me healthy, to establish the right relationships in my life, then I have to fill it in with the high value things for my craft, for the business. And so now with limited room, that sort of by default weeds out the non-essentials. And so what I've had to get really good at is using my calendar and sort of tools that connect into my calendar to say, all right, at the end of the day, what if I only completed one thing? What would be that one thing that I'm proud of? And can I be more comfortable with the things that keep piling up on the to-do list that are invariably going to keep, piling up and staying on the to-do list? Can I be skilled enough and thoughtful enough and insightful enough to know that I'm okay with those things not being completed, but each day, can I be happy with the one thing that got completed? And does it tie into where I ultimately want to go, a year from now, right? When I look back and think to myself, all right, I'm proud of the year that I built. And the things that I did every day were, of high value. And it got me closer to the mission that I have. And so that's how I sort of just structure my day. And I get comfortable with the things that are on the list that I know I'm not going to be able to get through. And then that's a forcing function to say, okay, if these things aren't getting done, who is better served to do them, right? And then I can, if I'm not getting it done and it's a reflection of the business is not performing, well, who is better suited to get those things done? So I can work with a vendor, a contractor to outsource those things. Um, but as long as I'm doing the high value things that I know, you know, help grow the business and are satisfying to me, then those are the things that I'm trying to prioritize. And I get those things done as early as possible in the day. And then the things that aren't getting done, either I have to be okay with it and delete it, um, learn how to automate it through getting better at AI, and using AI agents, or outsource it and connecting with the right people that I trust that can get those things done. Um, and it kind of comes back to not having the financial pressure to sort of, in one way, like financial pressure can be a good constraint because it forces you to move faster and be more clinical and precise with what you have to do and who you delegate those things to. In my case, it allows me the freedom and the timeline, but I have to now be the one that kind of focuses on the precision that's necessary. And so I use my calendars as a way to do that, and a system of, at the end of the day, reflecting back, did I do the one thing that is most important to me, that I know connects to my long-term vision, and that from a year from now, if I did those things consistently, I would be proud of myself. So I'm trying not to let my future self down, sort of every day, every week, every month, every quarter. Not saying that's easy, but that's the sort of mental framing that I go into each workday with.
Yeah, it's a really important point too to understand like what types of stress you like working under,
Yeah.
right? For me personally, I do not work well under personal financial stress, right? Stress of achieving goals or business uh, targets, totally different. But personal financial stress and kind of putting yourself in a position where you have that luxury to be super intentional and thoughtful and precise with how you want to operate is a massive flexibility, right? In terms of that luxury of doing it. Something I did want to cover too before we hopped off here was I think a lot of people who get to the position that you were in, right, where they're in a really strong corporate job, right, they're earning really well, they have a lot of things on paper that look good as it relates to lifestyle and what things look like. And when they want to go pivot and maybe take a few steps back to potentially go forward many more steps in this part of life, but also other areas of life too, they usually met a lot of social pressure from
Yeah.
people in similar positions, right? I know you mentioned you dug in really deep with a handful of coaches and financial folks around you to help make that decision with you.
Yeah.
Like, what pressures did you face from others around you, whether it be coworkers, whether it be people on social media, family members, right? That pressure that you face from saying, hey, I'm doing something that on paper may not be the route that most people go take. Like, what was
Yeah.
that like for you, and how did you handle that?
Yeah. I think the most helpful thing that I instilled, that I preach and coach to everybody I work with, is I set up something called the 3-level framework for myself. And it helped give me the support from multiple angles. And the way it works is the first level, the level above, is go to trusted sources, people that are maybe a few years ahead of me, that I aspire to be like. How can I learn from them? How can I either pay them to be my coach, or ask and beg to be their mentee, and just learn from them, and ask them the questions of like, hey, when you were in this position a few years ago, how did you deal with it? And what are some of the things that you would avoid if you were to go back and rewind and tell yourself? So I have that structure at the top, and I have just a handful of people that I trust, that I go to and get coaching and advice from. Then there's a level in the middle, And this is important to have like a support structure of those who think like you, who are maybe at the same level as you. Like sort of even what we're doing now is just talking through the challenges, even though each of our circumstances might be unique. We have sort of the same self doubts and limiting beliefs and thoughts and questions. So we try to work through those things collaboratively. So we're almost releasing the burden of having to figure it out. Even though I'm a solopreneur, I know there are other solopreneurs out there or individual business operators that I can go to and lean on, right, for talking through the same challenges that we're all facing. And then there's a level below that is an important source as well. And I did this, when I was even an active seller, was mentoring others or coaching others. Now it's sort of built into my business, but there are a few others who are now looking up to me and saying, "Yeah, I want to be like you one day." And so giving that knowledge back to them through mentorship and coaching helps me to also learn, right? It helps to kind of reframe, oh yeah, like I'm pretty grateful to be in the role that I'm in. What I am delivering is valuable. Others want to know. And so those three different levels sort of keep me sane, and it helps me to push back on anybody who challenges that. I think I'm lucky enough to have supportive family, um, a wife and friends who sort of always understood that I always played by my own rules. And so, um, nobody pushes back so much on why are you doing that? But there's definitely social pressure, and there's always questions that I get all the time of like, why would you leave a 7-figure earning role, right? Why not just stay in that? Um, I use the 3-level framework to sort of push back to say, no, pursuing your own thing. There's progress that you want to make in your life, um, and that's kind of the way I view my life. It's almost like a game. Like I'm at a different level now where I'm not. It's not just about the money. I've made enough, and I'm satisfied with enough. Now it's like, what can I do that's more interesting, impactful, and allows me to sort of explore other areas of my life that I didn't get a chance to do when I was sort of focused and hustling and grinding and just churning things out for others. Um, and I will discover things about myself, right? Because I have more time now that aren't always pleasant, but I think is necessary to sort of go through that and learn, because ultimately, again, long-term thinking, my future self is going to benefit from these things by going through that, even if they're hard. And so the 3-level framework was a way of just systemizing that calmness and stability that I need from all different angles, that helps me to, you know, stay calm and navigating these choppy waters.
Yeah, I use something similar in different words as yourself as well too, right? I think it's always important to have people you can go to who are in a position that you want to get to, right?
Yeah.
In some area of life, right? I think it's important to go have people that are in a place you want to be, to go ask for advice from, right? I think asking people for advice that are doing something very different than how you want to live, not the
Mm-hmm.
best idea. But I think also having peers you can go to that are in their own set of circumstances, but in a similar range or level to you, that are working on similar things, even if in different ways. And having those that you go teach or mentor to as well, to like, I think you also kind of perfect what you're doing by being able to go
Mm-hmm.
teach it, right, in
Yeah,
certain ways as well. And
for sure. Yeah.
on year end two, before we wrap up here as well, like, what final advice do you have for someone who may be in a really good corporate type role, but wants more out of other areas of life, right? And what final advice do you have for like
Yeah.
that type of person?
Yeah. I would just say, you know, explore your curiosities. So if there's something that you're really curious about bringing to life, I would say that you're in a really strong position now if you have a strong corporate role, or especially if you're in sales where you have a little more control over your income. Um, think of yourself in two frames. Think of yourself as like the professional that can pay for the things that you want. And I think it's best that, again, if you're in sales, especially if you're an experienced seller where you have a high base salary, let's just call it 6-figure base salary, try to figure out how to make your life expenses fit within that base salary. And then all the variable income through commissions and bonuses, that funds the other side, the artist. And where you have your curiosities, treat that like an art, but still be professional in that art form. Meaning, you're not going to just be haphazard with bringing to life whatever this thing is that you're curious about. You're still going to be professional, but from a financial standpoint, that's being taken care of from a base salary perspective. And anything else that comes in, you're thinking very thoughtfully about, I'm going to bring my art to life through this extra income, so that when I am ready to explore that thing and start building it, and the sort of the time frame that a lot of people advise that I benefited from as well is, if you start building that on the side, and a good time to sort of flip and pivot is when that art, so to speak, starts to generate the same levels of your base income. You can choose, right, what level that is. It could be half of your base income, or it could be your actual base income. That's a good time to sort of pivot, because now you're moving over and now you've saved all this, or you've invested all this extra income. And so that's your runway to move over into the art form. But if you've been able to do something on the side, coaching others, build an info product, or have made some sort of investments in the business on the side that's generating some sort of actual income, when that income starts to meet or surpass your base level of your salary, that's a good time to pivot and run full steam ahead with whatever it is that's sort of your true curiosity. Because ultimately, the best measurement of success in your life is having no regrets. And if you can sort of mentally fast forward to your life 10, 20, 30 years from now, can you say to yourself, yes, I'm glad I left when I did, to go pursue that thing that I was really curious and that was a burning desire of mine?
Yeah, you make a great point. The building up something else on the side before you go and allowing yourself that smooth transition allows for sustainability. That's one of the
Yeah.
biggest things. If you have that base built in that you go leave to, it's so, so important. But yeah, Brandon, thanks for coming on. Super helpful to dive
Yeah.
into it, and good seeing you as always.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. It was great.